Hey folks, so if you asked yourself the question, what to do to stay safe as a CISO, I can't answer it. I have no idea. Anyway, today I want to talk to you about risk estimation on a company level. First, perhaps a bit of expectation management. I'm not here with a silver bullet. As always, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. I will share my experience and what I personally perceive as a combination of methodologies that worked for me. I will also share some experience what did not work for me, obviously, and why it didn't. And maybe I can save you from one or the other pitfall. Cool. So, why would anybody want to do this? Why do you want to have a risk estimation methodology on a company level? Well, first of all, as a CISO, you want to balance risk, and you want to focus on the highest risks first, and you want to have your priorities laid out to the risk of the company, essentially to a part of the risk of the company, which is your part of the responsibility. And as a business leader, on the other hand, you want to balance that risk against other business objectives. At that point, I always remember what our former CFO, now he's the COO, very smart guy, said that somehow stick to my mind. He said, you can only spend every dollar once. So it's a natural thing that each business objective is competing with other business objectives, with any other. So you want to have somehow an indicator or somehow an idea on where to spend that dollar and where you get the most out of it. So I think in a role of being responsible for information security, you want to give an impression and you want to give an idea to the board where you are in terms of information security risk. So what should come out of this is you want to have estimations that are solid enough to base your own priorities on. You want to have an estimation that is universal enough to compare to other business objectives. And I also cannot stress this enough, it has to be understandable by non-technical folks, because this is the audience you would typically be speaking to. Let me perhaps start with a series of stuff that did not work for me. Also, a disclaimer, your mileage will vary. I don't want to offend anybody. Still, these are the things that did not work for me. If they work for you, lucky you. First thing, which is pretty common in companies, risk yards. You know what I'm talking about? Ever seen a risk yard? I see people nodding. Yes. I mean, the idea behind a risk yard is, or however you want to call it, is quite a good one, or the intention is quite good. So to say, when the idea is you collect the risk you already have, and you put it somewhere to keep track on it, to estimate it, and to somehow control it in the end. Unfortunately, those risk yards get quite huge. If you've ever seen such a SharePoint site, Excel list, wherever you track it, Jira, tickets, whatever. If you've ever seen such a list, you see they're very large, and they typically also contain very old risks that are dragged from year to year, keeping your resources. So like, in the end, you spend a lot of resources in tracking, re-evaluation, whatever, collecting those, like you would collect your Pokemon cards or whatever. That does not lead to or in my experience, it did not lead me to focusing on the main objectives for the company. It rather binded resources. So the obvious next idea is, let's build risk stacks instead. If we have a whole bunch of risks, being from penetration testing reports, from audit reports, from whatsoever, why don't we stack them up? Why don't we aggregate them? And why don't we derive our company objectives out of the findings that we have in the technical depth of the company? If you've ever tried it, you will, or at least I did, come to the conclusion that risk aggregation is quite a complex topic. And also, you are misleaded in the way that you only see a aggregated risk above the level where you take random probes. I mean, not to forget that most of the indicators that you are collecting and most of the indicators that you try to aggregate are in the end random probes. So you might be looking at the wrong direction, and you end up having a very complex scenario in aggregation in itself. What's also a very pragmatic idea is, let's take risk meters. Why don't you take what's already there? I mean, you have two objectives for which I presented in the beginning, like you want to build your own priorities and you want to compare to other business objectives. Why not skipping the second objective? Why not saying, okay, dear leadership team, it's your job to balance, I don't know, cybersecurity against everything else. Skip this for the methodology and focus on the first one, and there we take a maximum pragmatic approach of taking what's already there and looking at it. If you've tried it, you will come to, or you might have the same experience as I did. If you're looking, for example, at an Nesso scanner and ask your Nesso scanner for prioritization, then you might end up fixing TLS misconfigurations. While this being valuable in itself, it might not be the number one objective of your company. Same for other tools. Like, for example, if you look at the Defender for Endpoint and the security score recommendations, you might, or at least we did, or I would end up with a objective in my top 10 to install Microsoft Defender on our MacBooks. I don't say that's not valuable, but maybe it's not the number one security priority of the company. Next thing that also did not work too well for me is oversimplification. You probably also have seen a lot of risk matrices. Some of them are well balanced, some of them are not. No matter how balanced they are, they try to oversimplify the idea of getting risk in some manageable form. And they usually end up with a traffic light like estimation of, I don't know, green, yellow, red, something like this, purple sometimes also. And that's what you are supposed to present to your management. So like, while it works for presentations well, when you want to get the attention to a certain point from managers, you say red light, oh, this needs your attention, green light, oh, I have everything under control, whatever. It turned out for me not to be a good indicator in keeping my own prioritization. I ended up comparing a lot of yellow risk to a lot of yellow risk, and now which one comes first, right? Difficult. So, now let's head over what did work for me, or what turned out, at least for me, to be helpful, and to which led me to a way that worked for me at our current company. First of all, I thought it is, or I perceive it as being very important to choose and to keep your abstraction level through the whole analysis. The moment where you try to aggregate, or the moment where you try to jump from one abstraction level to the other, is the moment where you actually add a lot of complexity and you usually drop things. And yes, so in the end, if you want to base a risk estimation on company level, you should also have your threat analysis on company level, and you should also look at your impacts on company level. If one or the other is derived from other levels, then you're most likely losing something on the way. Second thing is to base stuff on solid ground. It's very, I would say, it's a very interesting and pleasing idea to just, I don't know, estimate numbers based on gut feeling. Still, you don't get very far with it. When you explicitly, the ISO auditor, whatever, will call this expert estimation. In the end, it's a type of transferring pure gut feeling into numbers, which you see a lot out there. I found myself to be more, people believe more what I say when I base it on solid ground, and when I know my numbers and figures, when I know where they came from, when I know why I think a specific estimation is how it is, and also why not. Also, it leads you to different kinds of discussions. I don't have that discussion a lot whether I'm competent enough to estimate a number or something. What you usually have when you just make up numbers. Instead, I have those discussions where they say, well, I don't believe in that number, and I say, well, I took it from there, I compared it to this, it somehow sounds plausible in total, what do you expect? Oh, what's your suggestion? Yeah. And then you have immediately a discussion about numbers, which leads to a better result in the end than it was in the beginning. Speak people's language. Very important. That really helped me. And it's also a bold move to do, to speak a language which you're not natively speaking. Like for a technician, for example, to speak about financial loss, to speak about probabilities in terms of financial loss per time period and stuff like this, because you cannot step back and blame it on the methodology or blame it on anything or on the interpretation of your numbers, which you could, for example, if you say, well, I think this is important because we have a CVSS of 9.8, whatever. Still, when you speak the same language as your board does, and they usually speak finances, then they understand what you are trying to say. And that's very valuable, to me, at least. And in the end, it's educated guessing. Also important to note, I don't take myself too serious. In the end, I know that it's about estimation. I know it's about educated guessing rather than it's about finding the sole truth, which we built everything upon. Cool. So how does this look in practice? How to do it? First of all, I would start with AdTech or threat modeling, depends on your scope and depends on how intense you want to play that game. You put yourself in the shoes of, let's say, an attacker, or you collect the risk scenarios which you think that are relevant within your scope. Nothing too spectacular. You learn that in, I don't know, on many places. And then you take your time to think things through. And that's a rather important step. Really, what helped me a lot is spending time in front of a sheet and really thinking that through. Not stopping after an hour, just think this through. That helped me a lot. And then challenging with others. Go into a group, have a peer review of your documentation, do the brainstorming together with others, have input from other departments, have input from other professions, have input from the finance department, for example. They have a whole different view most of the time. And then you end up with a collection of a threat landscape or your attack surface that you need to derive your risk landscape from in the end. So I don't know, nothing too spectacular. I guess everybody could have guessed the first at least, or parts of it. It's like, yes. Also, by the way, all of the presentation stuff is made up. I did not put the real company figures there, but I keep it as realistic as I can. Yes. Yeah. And then you end up with different entry points into your company with different threats that get onto your company. Also a hint from my side, don't mix it up with PCM too much. If your risk landscape for the whole company is based on the probability of plane crashes into a certain building, then maybe you're switching the abstraction layer at that point in time. And now for the more trickier part, quantification. Quantification is hard. Is hard in any way and is one of the hardest points in risk estimation. And a lot of time is spent over there. What helped me a lot is reading statistics, both the statistics of your own company and industry statistics. You have to consider trends, in my opinion, because if you only base your estimations on the past, then you are at best as precise as yesterday's risk landscape. That's the hint for insert brain here. Also, this is educated guessing. Some things that really helped me is incident statistics. When you look at the documented incidents of the last years of our company, you see that's a lot of text to go through. That's like the craftsmanship behind, I would say, to dig through those incidents and derive the factors and the statistics from them. How many hits do you really get? How many of them are relevant? What is the threshold where you consider a phishing incident an incident and not only a phishing email and stuff like this? What also helped me a lot is putting it down into different, smaller, and easier to answer questions. Like, for example, if you estimate the annual rate of occurrence, which is like the probability. Perhaps I also have some words on that, because that in itself helped me a lot when you don't think about the probability in which this will happen next year, but rather think as a how many times a year does this happen to our company. Then you have a different mindset to the same question, which helped me a lot, because you're assuming you come to this situation, you're just not sure about the time, right? Yes, and when you ask yourself the question, how many times a year does this happen to our company? Then you can also put this down into two questions, like how frequently are we exposed to the threat, and how likely is it that a exposure leads to an impact or leads to damage to the company itself. What also helped me is a translation table at hand. When I say likely, what do I mean in terms of numbers? When I say unlikely, what do I mean in terms of numbers? Also be aware that those translation tables heavily rely on cultural background. So I'm pretty sure that the average American employee, when I ask him or her, what do you perceive as being likely, has a different number behind it than the average European. That's like something you need to balance, or that I found usable of being balanced within the peer group where we reviewed it. Yes. Next, impact modeling. When we have the entry points and the threat landscape of our company, then we need to find out what really hurts us. So what are impacts to the company that we are afraid of, that we want to avoid, or that we experienced in the past? And there, again, looking at past incidents is a valuable thing to do. Also, again, taking time to think things through is something that is very valuable. And talking to business leadership within the whole company is also very, very valuable, because this way you learn what they are actually afraid of, which is quite different than what the IT department typically is afraid of. Yes, also they are clustered in different perspectives and on the abstraction level where you want to derive your risk landscape at. And then quantification again, putting a price tag. That's now easier than putting an estimation tag. At least I perceived it that way. Usually, when you ask your business leadership, they do have a price tag in mind, or they can derive one, and they can come up with a number. When they can't, the financial department is very valuable, and the financial department usually is also a number that is, or they can provide numbers that you can match up with what you hear from business leaders. For example, when you hear from business leaders catastrophic numbers and you match that up with the average worth of the business unit they are talking about, and it's slightly above, then maybe they are exaggregating. Yes, of course, a situation where we go out of business with product X has a price tag. You just need to find it. And when we look at past damages, it's also an interesting thing to see, to derive actual numbers. Things that helped me a lot is rather go higher than low, of course. Still don't exaggregate too much. We will see in the end where we come out when we exaggregate too much and put a too worst case scenario there. And I have no idea is something that in many cases can be expressed as a power of 10. What do I mean with this? When someone responds to me, I have no idea about the impact of this scenario. I ask him, is it 10,000 euro? Is it 100,000 euro? Is it 1 million? And then they have a rough idea, at least as a power of 10. That's something we can base estimations on. Of course, with a uncertainty that is pretty high, still a better estimation that I could come up with. Yes, also past incidents, of course. I once heard something like that will completely put us out of business, and when you look at the incident statistics, you realize this actually happened a few years back, and we're still in business, right? So, yeah, this is gold. And when we put everything together, we want to come to a point where we have a risk landscape that is as close to complete as we can. Of course, it will not be complete, but it should be more complete than the other methodologies that I experienced in the past. So I do this using, in a pragmatic way, a huge table. Also gets quite huge when you combine both views, like the threat landscape and the impacts. And then you go through the different intersections of both. And then, in the intersections, I try to find speaking names rather than precise ones. Why do you do this? Because people can imagine it better. When I'm talking about phishing here, for example, of course my scenario is called phishing. Of course, also when someone calls it, calls via phone calls or in combination with phone calls or everything, when there is a bunch of handy names and stuff that overcomplicate the scenario, we're still meaning the same thing. We're still meaning the same attack, although our scenario is not exactly called that way. Another very speaking example that I have is a scenario that we call the raging bug bounty hunter. That's something where everybody immediately has something in mind and knows what we're talking about, although, of course, it does not have to be a bug bounty hunter. It could be anybody exploiting internet-exposed low-hanging fruits. And it does not have to be raging. It could also be destroying in a very precise way or whatever. Still, it's a scenario where we have exploitation of internet-exposed low-hanging fruits, which leads to a destruction of our IT infrastructure. So we have a speaking name found for a certain scenario. I also did get the fact that participants that join a conference that is called MCTTP are not necessarily those that appreciate a catchy name. So far, so good. Now, to get this in a handleable piece, we cluster it. I cluster it in terms of, I ask myself the questions, are those both scenarios, whatever I call it, essentially the same thing? Then it's maybe one risk scenario. This way I get less. Also, I completely strike out scenarios that are unrealistic or that we usually know from Hollywood movies or whatever. There are a bunch that you can get completely rid of because you know from the very beginning that whatever you estimate will be quite low. You go through the combinations that are left over. You take the estimations you had from the beginning, where you have the entry point probability or the annual rate of occurrence and the impact that you estimated. And then you realize, I mean, those are made up numbers. But if Martin did not come with completely unrealistic numbers, then this would essentially represent a company that pays $1 million per year in phishing. So you immediately realize not every entry certainly leads to a impact, and you need to find out what the factors are or what the requirements are for an entry to go south and to produce that impact. So you go through that, you again think this through in the brain here, and you come to a list of things that, or requirements that you need for stuff to go south. Yes, and again, base this on statistics and on solid estimations. Of course, educated guessing in the end, but yeah, base it as good as one can on facts that you find on the way. Cool. So we derived at a point where we have a risk landscape, which we think is rather complete. And we derived at a point where we have quantification of both the entry points and the impacts that we have. And we even know the path between them. Also, by the way, something that I wanted to tell regarding the path between. This, for a university student, absolutely screams like path analysis. If you've ever tried it, I did. I did hard, I did long. Then you see that there are obvious shortcuts that can be taken. And there is a lot of effort that you would need to put in there that is essentially lost effort, because you in most of the cases, you're pretty aware of the most likely scenario or the scenario with the most impact. And if you combine that to a somehow realistic scenario, you get the path that you should be estimating rather than the whole bunch of paths. Anyhow, now we have all of this and we can multiply it. And that's like the easiest part of it and the most fun. Because when you do it, you derive at an estimation that is realistic, comparable, and that you can use to put your own priorities. You even get to a risk estimation that you can call in euros per year, which is awesome, isn't it? We call that annual loss expectancy, although it's not entirely the loss that we expect, and that our financial department sometimes has a different view on it. Anyway, it's something that is tangible by upper management, something that they understand. This is our annual loss expectancy for this risk. Awesome. And a bonus, and even that side product, if you ask me, would be worth doing it. You get good KPIs. When you look through your analysis, which you, of course, wrote down, and you are looking for the indicators that you took to get precise estimations, you realize they not only are really relevant for the estimation of your risk, so they are relevant for the risk of the whole company, but you also know the relation in which they are relevant. So you can even say one KPI is more worth than the other, and is factor X more worth than the other, which is awesome. Yes. I won't leave stage without talking about limitations also. Estimations look much more precise than they actually are. So if I derive at an estimation that is like, I don't know, 47,500 euros, then most likely, this is not the number that I want to communicate, but something that is much more rough, like, I don't know, 50K plus minus 20 or something like this. The estimations itself that come out look much more precise than they actually are because they are based on estimations. And this is what I mentioned before, and where I want to refer back. The more worst case your impact estimation, the more upper limit are your annual loss expectancies. So when you estimated an impact that is pretty much exaggregated, then you end up at a annual loss expectancy that is much, much higher than a realistic value would be. Yes. And as also said before, if you only base it on historical data, then you are, at best that precise as you would be with the risk scenario of yesterday. Awesome. And essentially, that's it. Like giving a rough overview, sharing my experience regarding risk estimation on a company level. Now, to the hall. Any, questions, remarks, comments, compliments?
First of all, applause, I would say.
Thank you.
The furthest away.
Very good presentation. I like that very much.
Thank you.
Are there any templates or standards one can start with? Because, when you model the threat landscape, for instance, you started from scratch. Maybe there are some templates one can reuse and adjust or modify or extend so to make sure we don't forget anything.
Absolutely, a lot of not only templates but also collections that are already complete that you can take to get some input and to get a more complete picture. I, for example, like to have the threat landscape of the BSI as a input. Also, MITRE ATT&CK is a very good source, not only in terms of what it's supposed to be, of course, but also as an input to reflect yourself and to get ideas about what your threat landscape should look like and what it should include and whatnot. So there is a ton of such resources out there. Yes.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. So I would like to know how often you get to review your attack surfaces. For example, the company's growing, they've got more products, they've got more web applications added to the company. So how often do you review this, refine it, and measure up to see that you're secure?
Yeah. Thanks for asking. I do this at least on a yearly basis because I think this is a reasonable interval. It takes some days to weeks to get to a complete look. So this is something I do on a yearly basis. And of course, whenever something new occurs, like when we introduce something new to the company that is obviously changing the threat landscape that we're in, then I also reevaluate. Happened one time this year, for example.
So thank you. My question is about the presentation slide. It was about the one that you combine the risk together. This one I didn't understand. Can you please explain?
Just give me a second.
Thank you.
Which one?
It was the one that you combine them together. Let's say there's.
This one?
I think it was the.
This one?
I think so, yeah.
Yes. By combination, I mean you take an entry point into the company or a threat that you have from the threat analysis, which is pretty much what you see on the left. And you take the impact that you got from the impact analysis, which you see on the top. And the combination of both defines a risk scenario that you should be thinking about. Yes, I derive the risk landscape from the combination of both.
Thank you very much for your talk. I like the hands-on approach very much. I have a question regarding the data you get from the company. Of course, you need a lot of visibility into the company about the problems you had in the past, the worth of parts of the company and other. If you had to level which kind of visibility you need into the company, what is the minimum requirements for an approach like this?
You should know whom to talk to, I guess. It's like when you want to know the impact or the different levels of impact or the different estimations, you should know whom to talk to. So you should have enough visibility to talk to your business leadership, at least the financial one. Sometimes sales is also very important. And you should have a direct connection to people that know these numbers or that can estimate them.
From my perspective, it could be very hard to have enough historical data from incidents. Even in larger companies where I used to work, there were very few incidents that had been documented in the past. Do you usually see you have enough data for this approach?
It is hard, and it was hard, and the documentation at this point was key, unfortunately. I mean, no incident responder is keen on documenting everything, but that's something that we had to do years ago. And we started like 3 years ago to document everything that our CSIRT actually does, and every incident and every case where they went active. And we had this documentation, and even having this documentation and spending that time and that energy into a proper documentation leaves you with the task to go through it. And this also takes days to dig through the cases and to figure out what you need, which statistics are valuable, how to classify which event and such things. Is a lot of effort, yes.
Okay, so it's basically you have to have the CSIRT for some years and document for some years before you can start with the approach. That's what you're saying, effectively.
Yes and no. To get a such valuable source of information as the CSIRT incident statistics, yes. If you want to have this approach without having documented incidents for the last years, you're basically back to other sources of information. You can still get statistics from other companies. You can still have other statistics of your company, like unexpected losses is maybe something that they can tell you. And stuff like this is something you can base your statistics upon. still it's not that valuable in my personal mileage than having incident statistics at hand.
Okay, thank you. I have another question about risk scenarios. So when you have identified which are the most important risk scenarios, you can tell your management this is it where we should look at and where we should acquire money for. But how do we break down which controls you would actually prioritize based on that? For example, if you identify users downloading malware via drive-by requests, drive-by attacks, and leading to a ransomware attack in your company as being a higher risk, you have probably different things you can different controls you can implement to circumvent it or to counter it. So do you have an approach to break down which controls would be more effective or more interesting to take a look at?
Yeah, of course, this is the next step that you have to take when you have those risk landscape. What I ended up with this approach is to give the leadership a feeling of how does our ransomware risk compare to acquiring a new business? That's an answer you can get right away. And you get an answer like, in which scenarios do I have to invest the most? Like, where do I want to focus on with the security team? Which in your example also would be ransomware, obviously. And breaking down the controls that you actually do is the next step you have to take.
Okay. I think that concludes your Q&A. I would like to say thank you one more time for your time and your great insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much.